They fired me 2 hours before the annual shareholder meeting, right there in the conference room, in front of every department head. My replacement was already seated, smiling like she'd earned it. What they didn't know? Every record profit number in their glossy presentation came from a forecasting model I built, and in minutes, that model would reveal the truth live in front of thousands of investors. This isn't just a story about losing a job, it's about watching arrogance collapse in real time. Before I continue my story, where are you watching from? Hit that like and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this unfolds. They didn't even wait for the meeting to start. I was sitting at the far end of the long glass table finalizing the presentation deck for the annual shareholder meeting when Mark Sloan, our COO, stepped in with that fake smile he reserved for bad news. "Jessica," he said loudly enough for every VP in the room to hear. "Your position is being restructured effective immediately. You can leave your badge with security." My stomach didn't drop. My pulse didn't spike. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, watching the ripple of awkward glances travel down the table. No one moved. My replacement, a woman I'd never seen before, slid into my chair like she'd been practicing it for weeks, placing her hands neatly on the keyboard I'd just been using. I glanced at the wall clock. 2 hours until the shareholder livestream. Dana Whitfield, our CEO, didn't even look up from her notes. She just nodded as if a housekeeping item had been handled. In their minds, I was already gone. But what none of them understood was that the record-breaking numbers they were about to show the world weren't some fixed set of slides. They were a live feed from the forecasting model I'd built. For years, I'd been the one who handled the real numbers, not the polished, PR-friendly ones they fed investors. I'd created the system to be airtight, automated, and impossible to manipulate without my clearance. Every quarter, the model generated 2 sets of reports: the cleaned-up investor version and the raw, unfiltered reality. And unless I manually overrode it, both versions would update in real time during any live presentation. I never told anyone. It wasn't paranoia. It was insurance. Insurance against exactly this kind of moment. I watched Mark take my place at the head of the table, brimming with the confidence of someone who thought he'd just tightened the ship. The irony was almost funny. They believed they'd erased me from the equation. What they'd actually done was remove the only person who knew how to keep their fantasy numbers from evaporating in front of the entire market. As I stood to leave, I caught Mark's eye just long enough for him to notice the smallest curve of a smile. It wasn't bitterness. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing the real meeting hadn't even started yet. I'd spent a decade in that building, watching executives make decisions based on numbers they barely understood. From my first year as a junior analyst, I'd been the one in the background cleaning up their messes, fixing broken formulas, catching errors before they reached the board, translating raw financial chaos into neat, investor-ready slides. When they promoted me to lead forecaster, I stopped playing cleanup and started building something better. A system that would keep the truth from being buried. It began as a side project, a simple automation to speed up quarterly reporting, but over time, I embedded safeguards into its core, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. The model pulled data directly from our accounting system, stripping out the manual adjustments executives love to sneak in before big meetings. It ran forecasts based on reality, not optimism, and it had one very particular feature. Every 3 months, on the morning of the shareholder meeting, it would push both the sanitized numbers and the unedited truth to the same presentation file. The only way to stop it was to enter a security key that only I knew. I never mentioned it in documentation. I never shared it with my team. Not because I planned to use it, but because I understood something most people in that company never would. If the truth isn't protected, it will be destroyed the moment it becomes inconvenient. I tested the system quietly, quarter after quarter, making sure it worked flawlessly. Each time, I'd enter the key, suppress the unedited numbers, and let the meeting run its choreographed course. No one suspected a thing. They thought the reports magically appeared perfect every time, like some spreadsheet fairy had waved a wand. So when Mark signed my termination letter, he wasn't just cutting out a person. He was pulling the one pin holding their illusion together. And the best part? By the time they realized the presentation was live-linked to reality, it would already be streaming to thousands of shareholders, analysts, and journalists in real time. I walked out of that conference room without a word, the muffled sound of their planning chatter fading behind me. There were no dramatic exits, no speeches about how they'd regret this. I'd learned a long time ago that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous. My badge was still warm in my hand when I handed it to security. The guard looked confused, as if expecting me to argue or at least ask why. I just smiled politely and walked out into the cool Chicago air. That was the last time I'd step into that building as an employee, but not the last time my presence would be felt there. Over the next 2 hours, I kept my phone silent, ignored texts from a few colleagues who had already heard the news, and poured myself a coffee in my apartment downtown. I didn't post anything on LinkedIn, didn't message recruiters, didn't even call my family. Noise would only give them a chance to prepare, to suspect something was wrong before the curtain went up. Inside the company, they'd be busy polishing their talking points, rehearsing smiles, and setting up the broadcast. They'd assume the presentation file was locked and ready, the numbers unchangeable. What they didn't understand was that nothing needed to be changed for this to work. It was already in motion, just like it had been every quarter for the last 3 years. Only this time, no one was there to stop it. That was the beauty of it. My revenge didn't require touching a single file after I left. I didn't have to lift a finger. All I had to do was stay silent, let them get comfortable, and wait for the moment they stepped right into the hole they'd dug themselves. The night before the shareholder meeting, I walked past their building on my way home from dinner. Through the glass lobby, I saw the late-night prep team huddled over laptops, cables snaking across the floor to the camera setup. They were running final sound checks, testing the live feed, completely unaware that the disaster was already wired into their system. The next morning, I woke early, not out of nerves but habit. I brewed coffee and sat by the window, watching the city wake up. Somewhere across the river, Mark would be pacing in his suit. Dana would be reviewing her speech, and the tech crew would be pulling up the locked presentation file. I imagined them glancing over the clean, inflated figures one last time, smiling at how perfect they looked. They wouldn't notice that the clock in the corner of the model interface was ticking toward the auto update. I didn't need to check it. I knew exactly when it would happen. My model would pull the raw ledger data at the start of the financial section, overwrite the projections, and push the truth live without warning. No alarms, no pop-ups, just a silent swap in real time. By the time they realized what was happening, the feed would be in front of analysts, major shareholders, and reporters from every financial outlet in the country. The detonation wouldn't come with a bang. It would come with the quiet click of a slide advancing to numbers they'd spent years trying to hide. At exactly 10 a.m., the broadcast began. I watched from my living room as the familiar Weston and Cole logo faded into the view of the shareholder meeting stage. Dana stood at the podium, framed by massive screens on either side. Mark sat just behind her, all confidence and self-importance, ready to take credit for numbers he hadn't earned. The first slides rolled by without issue. Opening remarks, strategic goals, a few buzzwords about market leadership. Then came the transition to the financial section. The model's timer hit 0. I saw the faint flicker on the left screen first, a barely noticeable refresh that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't know what was coming. The next slide appeared, and the air in the room seemed to change. Projected profits of $412 million were replaced by a stark $53 million loss. The slide after that showed debt figures climbing past $500 million. One more flicker, and a list of key contracts shifted to show red text, terminated, next to 3 of their largest clients. On screen, Dana's voice wavered, though she kept reading as if nothing had changed. But the live stream chat erupted. Shareholders demanding answers, analysts tagging financial journalists, retail investors in all caps. I refreshed the stock ticker on my tablet. It was already down 3% and falling fast. Reporters on Twitter began posting screenshots of the feed mid-sentence. The hashtags #Weston collapse and #numbers don't lie started trending within minutes. In the background, I caught Mark leaning toward Dana, his lips moving urgently, his eyes darting between her and the screens. She gave the smallest shake of her head, still speaking into the mic, trying to push forward. But the damage was already public, and it was unstoppable. Every slide brought a new revelation: unmet revenue targets, missed debt payments, delayed product launches. It wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. And the worst part for them was that no one outside that stage knew how it was happening in real time. For the viewers, it looked like they were confessing. For the market, it looked like fraud. And for me, sitting quietly with my coffee, it was the moment I'd been waiting for. The point where the truth finally took the mic and didn't need me to say a word. The camera caught it all, even when they thought it wasn't. Phones started buzzing on the table in front of the executives. A board member in the second row stood up and walked out mid-sentence. Dana's voice broke for the first time, her hand tightening on the podium as the CFO hurried over, whispering into her ear while the microphone still picked up the static of his breath. Mark tried to intercept, leaning forward as if he could physically block the damage from reaching her, but the live stream was still rolling, every viewer watching the panic unfold in real time. The tech crew in the back scrambled. One of them crouched under the console trying to force the feed to black, but the investors in the room had already seen enough, and the outside world had been screen capturing for 10 solid minutes. I imagined the private text chains exploding among major shareholders, analysts calling their contacts at financial media, competitors forwarding the feed to clients with a smug, "Thought you'd want to see this." Even as Dana attempted to regain control, stammering about data irregularities, the stock ticker in the corner of the screen kept sliding down, visible to anyone watching from their laptop or phone. The meeting didn't end so much as dissolve. Investors leaving in clusters, the board gathered in tight knots, Mark's face pale and tight. They didn't know it yet, but the real storm wouldn't come from the room. It would come from every regulator and journalist already circling their collapse. By the next morning, the headlines weren't just about the meltdown, they were about what came next. The SEC announced a formal inquiry before the market even opened, citing potential investor misrepresentation and internal control failures. Trading in Weston and Coal shares was briefly halted as the stock tried to stabilize, but every attempt to spin the collapse as a technical glitch only drew sharper questions. Analysts dissected screenshots of the live stream, pointing to the seamless data integration as proof that this wasn't a random upload error. It didn't take long for whispers to become facts. The numbers that appeared matched the company's internal ledgers, not the sanitized versions. Dana was forced into damage control interviews, her polished calm fraying as journalists pressed her on why the raw figures existed in the first place. Behind the scenes, the board moved quickly to contain the fallout. Mark Sloan was quietly removed from all financial oversight and reassigned to a domestic logistics role, a polite exile that made sure he'd never touch investor relations again. The CFO resigned within days, and every executive email was being combed through by compliance teams and outside counsel. I didn't need to do anything. I didn't send a single message or leak a single file. The system I'd built had spoken with absolute clarity, and now the law was listening. For years, They'd treated truth like an optional accessory to the business. Now, with federal investigators in their lobby, they were about to learn what it costs when the truth shows up uninvited. 2 weeks after the collapse, I was sitting in a corner booth of a quiet coffee shop when the call came. It wasn't from a recruiter or a headhunter. It was from the managing partner of a private equity firm I'd once saved from a disastrous acquisition with a single line in a forecast. They'd seen the live stream, read the reports, and wanted me on retainer as their exclusive financial risk consultant. The offer was double my old salary, with full autonomy over my work and zero corporate politics. I accepted without hesitation. A week later, I was in a top-floor office overlooking the lake, advising people who valued accuracy over ego. Weston and Cole had vanished from my thoughts, except when their name flashed across the news in another update about lawsuits and settlements. Mark's new office was reportedly the size of my old cubicle. I didn't gloat. The win wasn't in their downfall. It was in walking away into something better, free from the weight of proving myself to people who were never capable of seeing my worth. Sometimes the sharpest revenge isn't about destruction. It's about building a life so far beyond their reach, they can't even imagine standing in it. They thought they were cutting out dead weight. But what they really did was pull the pin on the grenade I'd quietly wired into the heart of their empire. And I didn't have to lift a finger to watch the blast unfold. I just had to walk away and let it detonate. This story isn't just about corporate revenge. It's about the quiet, unshakable power of preparation. In every workplace, there are people who hold the threads others can't see. When leadership values ego over expertise, those threads can unravel in seconds. I learned that you don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes the most devastating truth is the one that reveals itself without you lifting a hand. Protecting your work, your knowledge, and your integrity means building systems where the truth survives even when you're gone. This isn't about being vindictive. It's about making sure those who gamble with other people's labor understand the real cost of disrespect. The moral here is simple. Never underestimate your role in the machine, but also never make yourself so dependent on that machine that it can break you. Keep your leverage, protect your craft, and know when to walk away. True strength is not in destroying everything. It's in knowing you could, but choosing instead to let your next chapter speak louder than your past. How to get started today. 1. Document your work in a way that protects your contributions and proves your value. 2. Build skills and relationships that are portable, not tied to one company. 3. Learn to recognize when silence will speak louder than confrontation. 4. Always keep a next move in mind. Opportunities favor the prepared. If this story made you think about your own leverage, tell me in the comments how you'd protect it. Share this with someone who's ever been undervalued at work, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story.